Good evening, everyone. Thank you all so much for coming and being so punctual. And welcome to our Jewish Historical Society evening. I am Peter Lilienthal, president of the Jewish Historical Society of Fairfield County, and have the honor of introducing Vivien Orbach-Smith, a wonderful storyteller who's been an adjunct professor of journalism at NYU since 2001, and 2018 won the university's Outstanding Teaching Award. She's a freelance book editor and college essay coach. For years, she taught teenagers in several area religious schools and chaired multiple Yom HaShoah and Yom HaTzmaut programs, and is a member of our Jewish Historical Society of Fairfield County Board. You will be riveted by the story she tells with her father in Young Lothar. Having read the book and was bound by it, had a chance to briefly talk to Vivien about it. And what a wonderful, wonderful presentation of a story that took place at a time that none of us would want to live through. We asked Vivien to share her personal reflections and some artifacts marking her journey as a second-generation daughter and a writer, experiences that I'm sure will resonate for many of you who have logged in this evening. We will look forward to hearing questions, thoughts, and experiences after her talk. And Vivien, you're on.
Thank you, Peter. And thanks to the board, Marcy, the program chair, and Seema, my tech support, who brought me into the organization. I appreciate you listening to me today. This is a season of anniversaries and momentous dates. And yesterday, as I said, the Yizkor for my parents, like many of you, I said it in the traditional verbiage of my mother, my teacher, Imi Morati, my father, my teacher, Avi Mori. Even though I wasn't the best student always, but I want to share with you some of the things that I learned at their feet. And just a week ago, as we sat a little more than a week at the Seder table, we all sing the melodies that we remember from our youth. And in our case, it was the one that resonates the most for me was Eliyahu Hanavi, which my father always added a verse in German. As we stood and we opened the door for Elijah the prophet, in addition to the traditional Hebrew, he would use some very stirring language and say, Der Mashiach ist gekommen, Eliyahu war sein Name, went on like that. But in the end, he would bellow, we live in Frieden und in Freiheit. We live in contentment and in freedom. And at that moment, I would never and will never forget that at our table, we had a branded slave and a terrified refugee girl, and these were from whom we have descended. So it was in the early 1990s that my father asked me to help him tell his coming of age story in Hitler's Berlin. The result of it was a very revealing memoir of a hunted youth hungry to taste life only once, perhaps only once, in a lawless and apocalyptic city. Originally published in 1996 as Soaring Underground, an idiosyncratic title I gave it, that it was my shout out to the protagonist, Lothar, the wily Jewish youth whose light and spirit could not be extinguished, even in the darkest time and place. The now out of print book was rebranded in 2017 as Young Lothar. In co-authoring his memoir, I became a writer, a daughter, and a Jew on a mission. to give voice to the suffering, joys, and complex humanity of not only Lothar, but of 6 million European Jews, 1.5 million of them children, who were killed under systematic, targeted, state-sponsored genocide. My brother and I grew up fiercely loved and overprotected by our refugee parents and their proverbial village, an enclave of New Jersey-based Holocaust survivors determined to raise us, their miracle offspring, as a proud new generation of Jews, educated, empowered, and unconquerable. I will never cease to be amazed at how these shattered souls managed to find their places in mid-20th century America despite virtually no social or psychological supports. When I was growing up, there was no word for Holocaust, no word for what had befallen our parents. Their trauma was unspeakable, at first met by silence, people averting their eyes from the tattoo on my father's forearm, people even avoiding us on those warm summer days that he wore a short-sleeved shirt when he took my brother and me to the park. It would actually be years before the word Holocaust, Shoah, would be designated to represent what had befallen the survivors. Years before regular people would be ready to hear their testimonies. My brother and I were made to understand that our father's volatility and our gracious mother's bouts of sadness, all their protectiveness, overprotectiveness, and irrational fears weren't about us, but about a monstrous injustice against which we could all rail together. How could we blame them after all they had been through? Our father, a survivor of 2 years hiding in the Berlin underground, Auschwitz, a labor camp, a death march to Buchenwald. Our mother fleeing Berlin with her family after Kristallnacht at age 15, leaving many relatives and virtually all her friends behind to be engulfed in the flames. How could trauma not billow through our safe suburban homes, the epigenetic memory of it in our DNA, as neuroscientists now purport? Secondhand smoke, as second-generation author Thane Rosenbaum calls it. Even as a young child, whenever my parents tried to sing me to sleep with the only songs they knew, Brahms' lullaby, Rosinkiss mit Mandeln, the very first notes would cause me to sob uncontrollably. I do believe I had some primal awareness that these songs had been sung to other little children far away, but not so long ago, by adoring parents who had promised to protect them and keep them safe, because that's what a lullaby is. Sleep, Kinderlich, we will keep you safe. And that safety turned out to be an illusion, a fatal fallacy, an outright lie. And somehow, young as I was, I knew it. Such things didn't preoccupy my next door neighbor, Mary Lou, or the other kids that I tried to learn to be an American girl from. The kids on TV shows like Father Knows Best and Leave It to Beaver. At the foot of Mary Lou's bed was a wooden trunk, commonly called a hope chest, filled with her great-grandmother's hand-sewn quilts, leather-bound Bibles, antique photos in silver frames. I had very few heirlooms, not nearly enough to fill a hope chest, and they were gruesome in many ways, yet they did bespeak a kind of hope because they survived. For example, my grandmother's Shabbat candlesticks, which had spent the years 1939 to 1945 buried in the backyard of my grandparents' kindly Christian neighbors on Elsastrasse in Berlin, dug up and returned after the war. My father liked to tease me that I was such a lousy housekeeper that they looked better after they were dug up than I kept them. Truth. And then my father and grandmother's identity cards. With the J, you'll see them in the slideshow that I'm going to show, with the J for Jew, and Sarah and Israel as their middle names. And then a remarkable back of a cigarette pack that my father had a workman, bribed a workman to smuggle out of Auschwitz to my grandmother, leaving her a message. The only proof she had that her teenage son was still alive, which kept her wanting to live. And then my father's yellow star, the one he never, I don't know if you can see it. Well, it'll be in the slideshow. I'm not sure you can see it. The one he never wore in the 2 years he spent living in the underground with a false Aryan identity, submerged in a network of Hitler's so-called undesirables, subhumans, in a Berlin that had been declared Judenrein, free of Jews. A nice Jewish boy from a good family whose proud German roots could be traced back to the 15th century. A nice German boy who could not understand why his friends could be part of the Hitler Youth and he could not. Sleeping on the floor of a brothel, surviving as a pool hustler, a card sharp, a gigolo, a thief, before he was finally captured and taken to Auschwitz. The star was held onto my grandmother while she was hidden by a courageous family of communist women. No wonder my parents believed dangers lurked everywhere. Growing up in Union, New Jersey, attending a yeshiva, my brother and I were safeguarded from menacing dogs, rabid squirrels, undertows in Asbury Park, and every kind of sickness. My mother actually instructed me to keep my blinds shut on Colonial Avenue in case of snipers. And then there was the cavalcade of dreaded diseases. Ice cream was referred to as frozen germs. God forbid you should touch the doorknob of the bathroom at Port Authority, my gateway into the Emerald City, where I yearned to roam free and eventually did. And there was no one more triumphant at the discovery of toxic shock syndrome than my mother, who had long predicted that tampons were lethal weapons. Throughout this, I fearlessly flung open the blinds, partook of unwashed and occasionally forbidden fruits, and ate way too many frozen germs. I walked the streets of many cities, dove into blue waters headfirst, choosing to trust almost all the people I encountered along the way, and rarely finding cause for regret. But like most journeys, there are surprises and detours, and suddenly you find yourself in that place where the smoke is billowing. As convinced as I was of my invincibility, that by some triumph of nature and nurture, I had dodged the bullet of inherited trauma, I had no clue I was headed for a fall. My fall came during the first of what I now call my 4 Berlins, a trip with my then new husband in the summer of 1983 before spending the rest of that summer in Israel. Well, I'm going to transition to a quickly moving slideshow for much of my talk. It is quite telling that I can locate no photos of this trip, as if it was all a dream. I should have anticipated that something abnormal was brewing in the weeks before our departure when I found myself telling people I'm going back to Berlin, a place I had never been. This was compounded when traveling to Munich overland by train from Italy while my new husband slept. A young American missionary spent the ride proselytizing to me that the Jewish church has been silent for the last 2,000 years. Between that and the conductor barking at me to show me my papieren, I was pretty done in. Moments after we arrived in Munich, I went to a payphone to call our pension about the upcoming rental. Now, I have to admit that like many survivors' kids, at various times in my life, I have idly wondered, would I have been cunning enough, facile enough to survive? Yes, of course, pure luck played a huge role in every survivor's story. But could I have done what my father did, lived for years in hiding with a fake identity, keeping up this cover without a single misstep, even answering to your own name if someone calls it out in the street could cost you your life. So I dial this number, and the person on the other end picks up and says, "Hello," and I, who speak quite decent German, reply, "Shalom גברת, אני צריכה עכשיו לשאול כמה דברים על החדר שלי." Seriously, I'm on German soil for moments, and already I have outed myself as a Jude. I'm requesting a room in Hebrew. Game over. Me cunning, a survivor, like I'm the first one out in musical chairs. When I return to my husband and our suitcases, I can't even explain to him why I'm shaking. Then we enter the subway, and this time in my pretty good colloquial Berliner German that I learned from my parents, I asked an elderly trainman for directions. This is 1983. Immediately, he starts engaging me, very intrigued by my German. Das ist nicht ein Schuldeutsch. That is not a school German, he correctly observes of the flavor of my speech. Your family's German, he asks. Ja, I say. Ah, so you're here to visit your relatives. Nein, I say. He keeps asking me questions. I keep giving him minimal replies, and it is clear he cannot figure out what my story is. And then he eyeballs me and says in a very congenial voice the most extraordinary thing. Wissen Sie, Sie sind gar nicht ein deutscher Typ. You know, you are not at all a German type. Now I'm in Germany 15 minutes, and I'm Anne Frank's doppelganger from the cover of the book. Caught again. And I say to him, ja, ich bin ein deutscher Typ. I am a German type. I am one of the German types that das mal war, aber ist nicht mehr, that once was, but is no longer. And as I walk away, I see he is staring at me uncomprehendingly, like he has just encountered a creature from another planet. Another planet was what I expected Dachau to be my first time there, like I would see gray smoke rising from the ground like something out of a Stephen King novel. What broke my heart about Dachau, though, was its normalcy. The camp, so shockingly close to the train station, to the center of town. How could people say they didn't know? Everything now so clean and orderly, the nice museum, the gleaming pay toilet that I almost irrationally resented like hell having to pay for. A day so gorgeous, a sky so blue, the birds high above Dachau, soaring in and out like the children could not. I was gutted. We also made a foray behind the Berlin Wall into East Berlin to visit the Weißensee Cemetery, where my grandfather's ashes had been scattered, or somebody's ashes that were brought back from Sachsenhausen concentration camp, on top of his father's grave, and to meet Sylvia Ebel, who as a teenager, whose mother hid my grandmother, and also Lothar's accomplice in the robberies of stores where they stole and found food stamps. East Berlin was the bleakest place I had ever been in my life. I saw it through oversized mirrored Ray-Ban sunglasses that I refused to remove, even though people kept approaching me to buy them off of me outright. And the Weißensee Cemetery, though it's since been refurbished, was like a wild, overgrown jungle filled with the most elegant mausoleums and grand headstones for wealthy German Jews for whom there would be no visitors, no next generation. Sylvia was now a gray-haired woman in her 60s, living with her husband, Peter, in a Spartan apartment. One of the few facts in the book we altered was, just between us, that she and Lothar, young Lothar, were also romantically involved. On a rickety shelf of her bathroom where the paint was peeling was a single cosmetic, a bottle of cologne called Wild Love. When I asked her how she and her mother, Anne Dudatsi, had the courage to do what so few others did, knowing also then that it did not come from a religious conviction because they were communists who had no use for any religion, Sylvia said, "My mother told me that when you know something is wrong, you feel it right here." And she slammed her fist into her stomach. And you must always listen to that feeling. And besides, then she leaned forward and looked like a young girl with a conspiratorial smile. Es war auch ein Abenteuer. It was also, for teenagers, an adventure. For the rest of our stay, I was possessed by an unexpected animalistic rage that turned me into a complete stranger to my usual, rather non-confrontational self. I had nonstop fantasies of tripping or punching every smiling, robust, silver-haired person I passed on the street. I didn't, but I kept staring at them and wondering what their eyes had seen, what their hands had wrought. My only real eruption occurred in all places at a kiosk where fruits and vegetables were being sold. Seeking a peach that was ripe enough to be eaten immediately, I picked one up and hefted it in my hand, apparently a very big no-no. Das ist hier nicht das Ausland. You're not allowed to do that here. It's not the Ausland. The greengrocer barked loudly at me, ordering me to keep my hands off the produce. What burst out of me in German, a polite, rational person, was beyond inappropriate. Pardon me, I said in German. You burned my grandfather in an oven. I can touch your goddamn peach. With every shocked eye upon me, I was firmly steered out by my concerned husband. And I, who am a tireless traveler and a late night partier who was eager to try out Berlin's celebrated music scene, flung myself each night into the hard bed of the pension immediately after supper, sleeping 11 hours a night as if drugged. The fruit stand, the beer gardens, the museums, none of them were real to me. What was becoming real to me was a gone world of 6 million members of my Jewish family. Now I'll start to share the screen and we'll move through this rather quickly. So here we go. My first Berlin. Now the world of my father was real. Lothar Auerbach, youngest of 3 sons of Nellie and Aaron Auerbach, an innocent child, like so many of war then and now, born into the wrong place at the wrong time. Lothar's father, my grandfather Aaron, a decorated soldier of World War I, proud son of Germany. They moved from the town of Falkenberg, Pomerania to Berlin, to a neighborhood called Prenzlauer Berg due to rising anti-Semitism. They thought that the sophisticated cosmopolitan city would be better. It wasn't. Nellie Auerbach and her youngest son, my father, were inseparable for all their days on earth. Things had started to go bad when my father's bar mitzvah, instead of being held in the beautiful, elegant Riekestrasse synagogue, was held in the basement of an orphanage, happened to be called Auerbach Orphanage, a pretty dismal all-purpose room rather than the beautiful synagogue where my uncles had his older brothers had their bar mitzvahs. And here is Lothar's identity card. You can see the J that meant Jude and the middle name, Lothar Israel Auerbach. His middle name was not Israel. and the swastika beneath the eagle there. He was 15 years old at this time. And here is Nellie's, my grandmother's identity card, also called Sarah here, which was not her real middle name, but a way to identify her, and the swastika on the top. I'll come back to, my grandfather, Aaron, sorry, his picture was supposed to be here, but we'll get back to it, said he would leave Germany only on the very last train. He loved the fatherland. He believed it would be over soon. But here is his death certificate from the concentration camp, Sachsenhausen. He missed the last train. Meanwhile, in another part of town, Ruth Geyer was in kindergarten. To this day, German school children who are going to kindergarten have a big satchel of candies called a Zuckertüte, a sugar bag. The rich kids have sweets all the way to the bottom. The kids who aren't rich kids have paper and then sweets at the top to herald the first day of school. My mother's family, the Geyer family, were much more religious. My grandfather was a cantor, and Ruth went to the Adas Yisrael Girls' School. In fact, she would have never been allowed to date Lothar Auerbach because he came from a family that was too assimilated for the Geyer's taste. And in fact, many people have said that Hitler was a strange matchmaker. I'm glad he made this match. This is a newspaper from a page of a newspaper, Gemeindeblatt, from those times, that lists all the different synagogues that existed in the city of Berlin at this time, and their hours, their services, a whole page. But as things started to become more restrictive in Hitler's Berlin, things like cultural events and films and theater were only allowed to be attended by, were not allowed attended by Jews, and they needed to attend their own Jewish theatrical events only. And this was Regina and Cantor Yehuda's card of the theater they attended. By then came Kristallnacht, the night of the broken glass. And young Lothar looked out of the front window of his family's apartment on Greifswalder Straße in Prenzlauer Berg and saw the looting, the windows breaking in the shopping boulevard below. These are tickets that were given out by some people to harass Jews and make them feel uncomfortable during this period. Quite ironically, they say, go back to Palestine. Jew, one-way ticket to Palestine, to Yerushalayim. Well, Judah Geyer saw the handwriting on the wall, and the night after Kristallnacht, Gestapo came to the Geyer apartment, running their hands under young Ruth's bedclothes quilt, thinking her father might be hiding there. She remembered seeing their black boots as she made believe she was sleeping, terrified. Judah Geyer began to collect recommendations from the various synagogues where he had served as cantor, hoping to get a pulpit in the United States where he knew people who would send out an affidavit for his family. However, the father of Lothar And Aaron Auerbach was not as prescient. He had now 2 sons living in the United States, and he wrote them a letter. My beloved boys, not much to write about. I'm thinking you should not send deposits necessary for the affidavits. I think there might be still time to make it to Cuba. If you had taken care sooner, Manny knew what was going on here, but what's the use? You had only to work in our emigration. As this is our fate, perhaps we'll make it. Everything here has changed a lot. It is shocking. This was the letter. And like I said, he missed his last train out. And from the concentration camp Sachsenhausen, he paid someone to smuggle out his pocket watch to his wife and son, the one child that remained behind in Berlin, the only legacy they have from him. In the Weissensee cemetery, young Lothar sprinkled the ashes that they were asked to pay for, ashes that were brought to them to pay 144 marks on the grave of his own grandfather. The one time Lothar ever wore the yellow star was to the Jewish cemetery, where we also visited our first trip, the overgrown cemetery. After the, I'm going to go back. This is Sylvia, who I spoke of earlier, young Sylvia, and these are her mother, Anna, and her mother's sisters, courageous women, righteous Gentiles, who hid Nellie and Lothar. I'm going to come back to them. After this trip to Germany, I packed away my rage in my suitcase after my first trip. Back home, I was myself again. And after several years passed and we slid into a new decade, I became more than myself. I became a mother 3 times. And through this, something sank in deep that I had not understood back when I had defiantly walked the dark streets and dove headfirst into the waters. Back in the days when the word separation meant only one thing to me as a young woman and somewhat rebellious daughter. Separation meant a break from my overprotective parents. Separation represented freedom, autonomy, independence, everything I craved. Only after I had these children did I begin envisioning, even obsessing about other kinds of separations. I began to understand why families rooted in trauma held their children so tightly. We were their miracles. I know why my maternal grandmother, Regina, called me her himmlisches Wesen, heavenly vision, as a young child, and why, when I was hospitalized as a young child, my father refused to leave, was escorted by security guards because he refused to leave me alone in my hospital room and snuck back in at night. I could not imagine the terror that my Oma Nellie felt every time her Lothar, her baby, left their Berlin apartment, wondering if he would return and how much she missed her 2 older boys in the United States, wondering if the family, minus her murdered husband, would ever be reunited. But the one whose angst and sorrow was the most palpable was my mother, who ironically had escaped Germany before full darkness fell. Ruth Geyer hated living in Brooklyn, where 3 of her young adult grandchildren, my son and my brother's 2 daughters, now consider themselves lucky to live. Her Brooklyn was poor and run down, and it paled beside her beautiful cosmopolitan Berlin. And she was terribly lonely. She was the 1 out of 10 of the Adas Yisrael's 400 Adas Yisrael schoolmates who survived. And like many refugees, She desperately put ads in the German Jewish newspaper, the Aufbau, seeking news of her friends' fates, especially her best friend, Lore Süskind. At first, there were regular letters from Lore with the swastikas as part of the postmark. I can see my mother's attempt at covering it over with a pencil. But then they stopped. Years later, when my uncle went back to post-war Berlin as part of the US Army, he discovered Lore's fate, alluded to in a gut-wrenching telegram he sent my mom. The Gestapo had come to arrest the Süskind family in their Berlin apartment. Lore resisted and was dragged down several flights of stairs by her long ponytail. They shot her to death on the front steps of the building before taking her younger brother and her parents to a camp, fates unknown. And what of my mother's adored baby cousin, her babysitting charge, who had the same first name as she, Ruth? My mother never stopped believing that her aunt and uncle, my great aunt and uncle, her aunt and uncle, Marie and Moritz Vulkan, gave away their blonde, blue-eyed baby to a Christian family or a convent to save her. Ruth Vulkan was born in 1940. Today, she would be only 82 years old. Could she be alive somewhere today, perhaps not even knowing her real name? Was there ever really a Lore Süskind or a Ruth Vulkan? There was. And this is why I like to say their names. As the Nazi hunter Simon Wiesenthal said, when a few people die, it is a tragedy. When a larger group die, like in a plane crash or even the 9/11 catastrophe, when it's a catastrophe. But when 6 million people die, we call it a statistic. It only makes sense one life at a time. That is why when I nervously agreed to help my father write this book to tell his story, I knew it would be one about life, one life at a time. This is his transport list to Auschwitz, where he found his name. It would be a story about unquenchable youth, people of courage, and Jewish spirits that keep soaring underground. It was hard to stomach what had been done to my daddy and what my daddy especially had done. But I could never imagine the rewards of parting the veils that existed between parents and child, or what has come from hearing from readers from all backgrounds. This is more of Lothar in the underground. This is Nellie's diary. I'll come back to this. This is Lothar and Nellie on the boat to the United States. This is the marriage of the two who probably should not have met. My father was able to tell his story at the New Jersey State House. And one of the most beautiful things that happened was that Sylvia and her family were placed on the Wall of the Righteous in 1996. And the Israeli government invited her and her husband during the 50th anniversary of statehood to come and represent Germany as honored dignitaries. It was their first time out of Germany since the fall of the Berlin Wall almost a decade earlier. In 1999, I nervously undertook my second Berlin. A German TV show called Aspekte, like Our Dateline or 2020, wanted to feature Larry and Sylvia in a segment about the book, which had been newly released in a German language version. This time I was well prepared for my anger, but not for my father's complex joy and sorrow, held in each hand at being in the city of his birth. the culture, the language that he would have never stopped loving if not for Hitler. It exhausted me. He exhausted me. He was a natural in front of the camera. They called him the Harrison Ford.
An der Rüke-Ecke Knapstraße im Prenzlauer Berg treffen wir Larry. Und er erzählt uns, dass er hier schon vor mehr als 60 Jahren gestanden hat, als Kind in seinem Berlin. Damals hieß er noch Lothar.
What had just happened was we broke for lunch in the filming, and unexpectedly a klezmer band, young men dressed in vaguely retro shtetl garb, set up to play impromptu. This faux recreation of Jewish music, Lothar loved it, jumped up and danced. Camera crews saw a photo op and scurried after him to get the shot. The faux recreation of a destroyed Jewish life repulsed me. I ran into the bathroom and refused to come out. The gray heads that had populated the streets were far fewer in number. This is the Greifswalder Straße apartment where he came in and actually described his escape. And I stood on that balcony and looked out at that street. The book had already been written, but as I looked out at Greifswalder Straße, I said to myself, could this be real? It was. My one souvenir of that trip, 2 postcards from a flea market, which I framed. Die Welt ist schlecht, das Leben ist schön. The world is evil, life is beautiful. My third Berlin, now with my children on the eve of my son's bar mitzvah. In 2004, we took our 3 children and my brother's older daughter on a roots trip to Eastern Europe. Of course, Berlin was the centerpiece, and so was Auschwitz. Once again, we gained access to the Greifswalder Straße apartment. It was freshly painted and for rent. We scarcely knew what to say to the rental agent. Now it was time to go back to Auschwitz. Yes, that's what I said at the time, back to Auschwitz, another place I had never been except in my dreams. We were stunned as we went into the latrine where my father had been when a transport was leaving for a labor camp, that we were standing in that exact place. And Lothar had said that he was almost one of the last people on the transport. And there, from Auschwitz, I got a list and I see his name as number 280. Indeed, he was. At the end of our visit, I stood with my teenage daughter, Ariel, on the same railroad tracks where my teenage father had once stood, and she asked me a question I was unprepared for. So, Ma, did you get what you came for? Did I even know what I came for? I was pretty sure I didn't. It was a jarring question at the end of what had turned out to be for me a most peculiar day. A day in which I, who had spent my lifetime weeping for the victims of the Shoah, shed not one tear. A day that I, who was always vocal against injustice, was subdued and quiet. A day in which I felt it walking for the first time on the ash and bone of Birkenau, felt inexplicably at peace. It feels transgressive to say this, but it is true. I didn't forget or minimize what had happened there. I mourned deeply all who were lost, but in my deep mourning, it had suddenly somehow given way to something else. My second-hand smoke felt like it had cleared. At first, I didn't understand a bit of it. Was I numb with shock, blocking out my surroundings? Probably, but there was more. Somehow along the way, without really noticing it, as Rainer Maria Rilke had written, I had lived my way into some answers. Not answers, really, because there are no legitimate rationales for dehumanization, genocide, Jew hatred, or any form of senseless bigotry. But somehow, I was at peace. It dawned on me standing on the train tracks that it was in the 20 years since I'd last stood shattered in Dachau, I had done the best I could. Stumbling and flawed to raise Jewish children, to build Jewish community, to write, to teach, to learn, to laugh and to love, not simply to be tolerant of others, but to authentically embrace the stumbling and flawed, gorgeous humanity in all of us. Or I tried anyway, and I pray I'll never be cynical enough to stop. I looked over at the children and I thought of my parents, my mother already of blessed memory, my father probably in his chair in the den in New Jersey, cheering on the Yankees on TV. And I said, yes, Ari Shin, I think I got what I came for. I realized that my parents, for all their trauma, for all their mishigas, for all the ways I resisted their control, had done some things right. And to distill them, looking back, they spoke out, they didn't keep secrets, they didn't keep us in the dark. They made us understand exactly what was at the root of our parents' anguish. Hitler, Nazis. It may have been baloney, but it was a very good boogeyman and helped instill compassion in us as American teens of the crazy 1960s, if not always compliance. Through ritual and tradition, they strove to create meaning where it might have been meaningless. They found something to believe in and to work for, the state of Israel, which they ardently loved and believed in, instead of hating and believing in nothing. They seized humor, dark humor, in my father's case, sometimes really inappropriate humor. Larry Auerbach definitely had a bit of the Larry David, where they might have drowned in tears. This humor, which my brother and I have definitely inherited, did not always go over well with our more genteel house guests, or with my very genteel mother. They embraced community instead of being lonely for what they had lost. They gave instead of dwelling on what was taken. They delighted in us and all that was sweet, and were determined to turn their backs on what was bitter. Together, as a family, we argued heatedly, we screwed up mightily, we argued some more, and we loved authentically. Finally, by my fourth and final Berlin, in the winter of 2016, I was an orphan. A startup company called Detour.com contacted me about doing a GPS-guided audio walking tour of Prenzlauer Berg, the now very trendy neighborhood where the Auerbachs had lived, built around young Lothar's saga of escape and survival. The producers asked me to help script and narrate the tour. I confess that by then, my serene spirit was once again agitated. The countries I loved with all my heart, the US and Israel, were in the throes of political upheaval and bitter divisions. I was not the same daughter who had helped bring Soaring Underground to life as a cautionary tale about history. I was a grandmother who already knew the names and faces of the Jewish children who were my grandchildren, who would live in a future I would not see. Rising anti-Semitism throughout the world, from growing fringes on the right and the left, a world of authoritarian leaders, splintered hate groups united and galvanized by the internet, were giving rise to what remains my greatest nightmare, that the world of my children and grandchildren might be more like the world of my parents and grandparents. Almost no gray heads remained in Berlin, but there were new haters to contend with there and everywhere. I spent a whirlwind week with Christopher, the young producer who was developing the tour. Together, I'll do that at a different time. Together, we went to the Auerbach Orphanage, site of Lothar's bar mitzvah, where the bricks showed the names and ages of the 60 children and caregivers who had all been taken to Auschwitz in a day or two and gassed immediately upon arrival. And amazingly, once again, we were inside the apartment at Greifswalder Strasse, let in by the young woman who had lived there for over a decade, first with several roommates back in her student days, and then, when her roommates dispersed, with their husband and young children. How we came to gain entry, very briefly, is another quintessential Larry Auerbach story. In a nutshell, My dad's last visit to Berlin was in 2006, about 2 years before his death, with my brother and his family. Early one weekend morning, Larry goes to his old apartment, knocks on the door, carrying several copies of his book, and proceeds to tell the stunned young women who are having their breakfast coffee that this was his apartment until the Nazis came, and showing them the tattoo of Auschwitz on his arm. They had never seen such a thing or met such a person in real life. One of them, Uli Bacher, became his pen pal via email. He invited her to come and stay and couch surf in his Manhattan apartment. By then, with my mother gone, he had moved out of New York. He was a city guy at heart. She did. So the pretty young woman, the young German woman who lives at 43 Greifswalder Straße, became Lothar Auerbach's last great gal pal from Berlin. This is the courtyard where he escaped with his mother. Finally, 2 emotional finds rounded out my most recent trip. A small museum dedicated to the courageous Germans who risked their lives hiding Jews opened a year after Lothar's death, the Museum of the Silent Heroes. There I found Anna Dudatzi's name etched on a wall and her photograph and biography and my father's in their computerized registry. That's Anna Dudatzi. Also on the wall was the name of Nellie Orbach, my grandmother. And apparently they had provided Sylvia's family a photo of Nellie, who had adopted the identity of a Dudatzi Tante, Ida Peters. It was a cheerful photo of a child's birthday party, but I gasped when I looked more closely. A cross purchased on the black market, not just was around her neck, not just any cross, but the exalted Deutsches Mutterkreuz, a cross bestowed upon mothers who had several sons fighting for the glory of Germany. Wearing this cross detracted from what can only be described as Nellie Orbach's decidedly non-Aryan appearance, causing Gestapo men and women to gallantly offer her their seats on trolley cars and salute her. And finally, the most emotional find of all, and with this, I will close. I had brought with me a stack of documents and photos for Christopher to review to see if anything might be relevant to our project. And at one point, he grabs this onion-skinned piece of paper from me, and he gasps, "Vivien, do you realize that this is a poem about the cemetery that is on the walking tour? Do you know that your father wrote a poem about it?" I didn't. It was above my German comprehension. I had once Google translated it, and it was pretty terrible. So I never paid much attention. But my young German cohort did. And sitting there together, he translated it for me in real time. And both of us sat there sobbing uncontrollably, reading the words of 21-year-old Lothar Auerbach, newly liberated from Buchenwald, adrift in his unrecognizable city, as if we were holding the heart of young Lothar in our hands. The poem, "Slowly I walked, still I can't grasp it. I can't believe it. Yes, I'm really alive and have the open sky above me. Oh dear God, what is this? Why did you choose me to live? How is it impossible that only I am alive? Most all of the others have gone. There where only you can love them, for they are with you and they are eternal, and so they are now. They, like you, will never be forgotten. They are the conscious of the living." With these heavy thoughts, I sought to comfort my soul's loneliness. I searched for my loved ones, but found only desertion. Not even a photo or a keepsake was left for me. Where should I go? Who still loves me? Where do I find my family? There was nothing anymore, only I myself, and this brought me no solace. I don't know where my path was leading me. I felt I must walk, flee from my own self, my own thoughts, my isolation, my terrible ache. A cold evening wind approached, and it was as if to call me, ask me in an unfriendly, icy voice, "Where to, stranger? Where to?" And I listened. Did I hear correctly? Stranger? Was I truly a stranger in my destroyed city? My eyes filled with tears, and I was seized by a single wish, to have friends once more, to be home once more. I lifted my eyes from the ground, and as if an invisible force had propelled me, as if my own blood steered me there, I found myself in Berlin's old Jewish cemetery near the Jewish orphanage. Everything that surrounds me had been destroyed. Were not even the dead permitted to sleep? Suddenly I lost my footing, stumbling on an unkempt path overgrown with ivy. Glancing down, to discover the reason for my unsteadiness, I came upon a chunk of rock, a fragment of a gravestone that had been shattered by the bombings. Upon it, Ben was clearly etched in Hebraic lettering. Ben, the Hebrew word for son. A feeling of indescribable joy, a symphony of sweet memories coursed through me. Son, yes, I was a son of this people who were chosen to suffer, of a people who, through dark night and hardship, reawaken again and again, of a people who, by the grace of the Almighty, always rise up to a new and better life. My soul was roused from its deep slumber. Now I want to fight for my people that they will never again suffer. Now I want to fight for peace. A cold stone gave me new courage, new life. Today, there are very few left in the noisy village of survivors that raised me. My father and mother now have their namesakes, Lador Vador. The three Tartakovsky girls are also the grandchildren of survivors on their father's side as well, of the Warsaw Ghetto, and their grandfather in San Francisco as a young man fled persecution in the Ukraine. When my daughter gave her firstborn the first name of Malgot, she was unaware that Lota's baby sister, who died in the first year of life, was named Malgot also. And little Ruthie Leva, I'd like to think that she is named for Ruth Vulkan too. Lota Eliezer Orbach has his namesake, Laser Leva, Eliezer Leva, the same smile and the same impetuous spirit. My father liked to end his talks with the word l'chaim. Whether or not one has a glass in hand, there's a powerful message in this word. L'chaim, as you may know, is in plural form. So we're not actually declaring to life. That would be l'chai. We're saying to lives. Why? A midrash I once read gives a beautiful interpretation, that each of us has the power to reinvent ourselves, to build more than one life, to speak truth to power, to seek the path where our soul belongs, to examine our relationships and our acts. Yes, the Holocaust was a monstrous, singular event in history, and at the same time, not the only genocide, nor tragically the last, as we are watching innocents whose lives are being shattered by extremist leaders, governments, and ideologies in the Ukraine and many, many more troubled spots around the globe. Few of us, thank God, will ever know such horror, but there are personal trials and sufferings, deep losses, unmet yearnings that can break hearts and spirits. One of the main reasons my father wanted to write his coming of age story is so that people would see no one else as the other, but as people like us, young people especially, with the same yearnings, hopes, and dreams. In the word l'chaim, we are given a gift, the promise that there is hope, that we can rise up, refashion new lives, heal ourselves, and perhaps together heal the world. Thank you so much for allowing me to share one family's story of struggle, of Frieden, and of Freiheit. Shalom and thank you.
Well, Vivien, that was a phenomenal story, just terrific. And thank you so much for sharing it. And I must tell you that having read the book, to see that there's more to the footnote of that book, and you told it today. It's about telling the story, and what a gift that is. I thank you very much, and thank you for all that you do. Well, take
Thank
care,
you.
everybody.
Thank you, Peter.
Okay,
Thank you all.
take care, everyone.
One quick thing, if you'd like to know more about the book, www.younglothar.com is my website. It has my email address if you'd like to reach out and talk about this and share your thoughts and stories. I would be honored to hear from you.
Okay, that's great.
Thank you.
Vivien, thank you so much. And fortunately, we're going to see each other soon again and to share more stories. And good night, everyone.
Thank you all for coming.